I don't know how really you get things going that quickly, but in just a few months there was a good designer and a modeling tool. Then you can always, of course, say that yeah, it's not as good as we would like it to be, but that doesn't mean it's unusable. So and then things have piled on, and basically the major breakthrough I think from usability standpoint was the view models that we were basically forced into.
That's what I was going to say is the piece that's missing in Eco 3 is the view model, for sure.
Yeah, and a fun fact is that the Bold framework, which is still in use, have gone open source, and they have a chat forum, and I sort of look at it from time to time, and just today they were fascinated about what they call the span fetch that allegedly had been invented by Jan Nordén. And I have a bit of I want to raise a finger against that fact because I don't think it was. I think he did the prefetch, but not the collecting of things together as the span fetch did. I thought that thing came from our end, and if you see the view model files to this date are still called .spans, and that's really the initial need for declaring ahead of time what kind of data to fetch together. So if we can do that with a declarative way, like expressing it in model transformations only, and when we had that, we started with that at a firm for what was it called, the ones selling CDs.
Logistics.
Yeah, the logistic firm. So, and once we had that, it became obvious that the resulting data had given types, and probably if you wanted to fetch it, you probably wanted to show it. And what if we were to derive the UI widgets from the types on the result? And then we added the extra meta information about where in a sort of square grid do you want to place these pieces of data. So that's the sort of the progressing of the view model construction. And then one thing that wasn't or got invented later on was the concept of currency, because in Eco and in Bold you had to place all these currency handlers to point into lists to show what was the user pointing at, and then you knew what to do further downstream from that pointing. And as we introduced, since this was everyone needed this all the time, it was sort of obvious that currency, we needed that in some sort of form. So we introduced the vCurrent variables in the view models, and those are sort of maintained automatically, and everyone knows exactly what's selected and what's pointed at. So that
Can I just make an addition there, Hans? It's important to understand that you could say the first span fetch is a fetch, but that's not true, right, about the view models. They are bidirectional,
yeah,
and that is basically enabled by the underlying, we still call them echo spaces, right? Eco spaces. So, and the subscription model. So that's why it's not as, they have the MVC paradigm and the view controller and those things. The thing is that they are too labor intensive, but they kind of need to be labor intensive in that case, because there's no way to determine how to reverse the answer back into a different space, or in the case of classes. So the view model is bidirectional, and that only works because we have this strict type control under the hood, and that you're doing it in memory, and then you can take you could say the dirty stuff out, right, in the order that's needed. So it's this sequencing that you don't.
Yeah, the whole idea of keeping a domain layer to keeping the objects is a trade-off, of course. It would be less data in memory if you only fetched exactly the things that you're going to show on screen for this use case. But if you fetch only the tuples that's extracted from the database and possibly calculated as well in the database, you don't have enough meta information to do them bidirectional. You don't know where to put data that's updated, and you don't know how to derive things if they are dependent on other stuff in your fetch. So MVC and what everyone does still, which is sort of fascinating with MVC and the object framework for entity frameworks from Microsoft, is that fetch, throw away, fetch, throw away, fetch, throw away. So and we don't do that. Pros and cons, but the pros are it's much less work constructing the system.
Yeah, my point was a little bit that's why it's, sometimes you think, well, why don't you just do it? Why just not invent a view model anywhere? Well, then we need this, and then you need that, and so it's like a long stack. So and we have always sometimes when gone back to that book, who wrote that about patterns of enterprise.
Fowler.
Right? And it's like if you take that book and you compare it to the stack, you can find all these things implemented. And the thing is that you just need them. You can't be without most of them, because if you are without them, you're lacking an essential piece of what makes it possible. But then, so that's one. And the other thing was that along the way, since 2009, then 2008, we have found more and more uses for the view model as a provider and the read-write vehicle. And so I'm sure there will be new ones in the future, but the obvious ones, of course, is APIs, which is just a user interface with a human further away, and reporting and tons of different little use cases that all need this. But especially in APIs, they are gold because, of course, they're bidirectional again. And also when you're importing things, transforming things. Also, if you haven't used it yet, look at the transform OCL operator. Really neat little thing. If you have one part in your system and you need to mangle them into a different part, for example, in a publication process or something that is one way, usually at least, you can just use that to transform from one structure to a different structure using a view model.
And I do that all the time with transient classes. I'll massage data and, take, say, 7 attributes and make them into one so that it's easy to display and put on a report or on a screen.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking about displaying them now. I'm more like if you want to, let's say you have statistics that you want to show up, and you model how the statistics should be stored in new classes for easy accumulated access. Then you can make a transform view model and say transform from this to this. And then it will do that using the view model. And then you can turn on auto subscription on the view model, and then it will do that as efficiently as possible. It will automatically detect that this view model needs to be refreshed, and then it will rerun the transform.
Yeah, and some languages like JavaScript has this ability to duck type. If it looks a certain way, it can just act on things because it's these properties are supposed to be there, even though it's not the same class. And you can't really do that with strongly typed languages like C# and C++. You have to, in that case, have an interface. But the transform is a sort of a middle ground. You can always assume that if your data structure has certain properties and looks a certain way, you can transform it into something else to act on it in a generic way. So that's sort of a good, a very good tool, and we have been extremely fortunate or lucky or whatever to have the view model abstraction that we introduced early has really proven itself to be useful in so many ways. And sometimes we sort of think, is this something else, the need that we see in this case? No, it's not something else. It's just the same plain old view model doing transformation on the data that we have available in the model. So it's a really good multi-usable tool. Should we take a short survey on the participants here on if what we want to bring up, to see if some sort of agenda, if there's something that someone wants to that we want that we should talk about. Maybe we could. We have the view models, we talk about those, but we do that all the time. And what's coming up, I can say that I just added to the installer Visual Studio 2022, and it's in what do you call it? It's in preview, so you can install MDriven for that if that's your bag. We have currently exposed NuGet packages for .NET 5 and updated that a bit to make it easier to start with .NET 5 development.
Is there a .NET 6?
Yes, and that's in preview.
Okay.
So that will be the next thing, but that's just more of the same. So it's no need to actually introduce .NET 6 for the things we do. It can be on .NET 5 so far.
Is .NET 5 based on Net Standard 2, or is it 2.1 or?
2.1, so it's compatible with .NET Standard 2.1. So some of our assemblies are in 2.1. And that makes them more versatile, that they can be used in different scenarios. Now it looks like all scenarios is converging to .NET 5 and .NET 6, so it's not a big issue anymore as it had been, with Blazor being one stack and Xamarin being another stack, and then we had the stack on this 3D engine called what was it called, the game engine there. So there was a lot of different compilations that was slightly different. So it's good that it's converging, less work for the build server and for us. So it's mostly when we add new stuff that if we have like 20 different projects almost the same. If we add a new file, we always discover, oh, it doesn't build for Xamarin anymore. Okay. So good with conversions.
Maybe this is a bit off topic, but I have my SQL Server in Azure, and I'm developing and have my production environment in the same database. Not only the same server, same database. It's ongoing development on my product. It's integrated with several different web shops or marketplaces, and I have my own structure for order management of products, so on. And I'm paying Azure like with euros, 50 euros each month, and that's just for my own data. It's not that much, so that's really expensive.
How much did you pay?
350 euro.
350.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's and it's not cheap once you start turning up the CPU and things. So, and it's very different in pricing if you do if it's dedicated CPUs or if you just take them from the bucket. It's two different price strategies.
Okay. So my question was,
Can't hear you.
when can I move this to Linux and on a more cheaper platform?
So I guess you can move it to...
the database I can move. MySQL or...
Yeah. So we don't do much MySQL, to be honest. So there might be things that are lagging, but we're focusing on SQL Server. And it's very different depending on how you if you do dedicated CPUs or not.
Yeah, okay. So I have to check that because the business case don't add up.
No.
For one customer needs to pay.
So I've been in that situation as well, that I thought that, well, I need at least 2 CPUs on this one, and they are dedicated. And then it sort of skyrocketed to hundreds of euros per month directly. And then I said, well, maybe they don't need to be dedicated. They can be in a pool. Then it was much, much cheaper.
I have to check that. Sorry.
Yeah, but pricing is an issue, and it's always...
I don't even know the value of M coins, so I don't know what's hitting me later.
No. So M coins was one thing that we tried, and it hasn't really taken off. I think we still have the idea that the way our license model should work is that it should be based in what you pay after usage. But we don't really know 100% on how things will look in the future. Now when we turn to enterprises and we do specific deals with enterprises, we have a discussion, and we have the M coins calculation as a basis for reaching a offering price, and then it's always a negotiation.
You said that you were like you started talking about what do people want to talk about. So, but I don't know if everyone felt that they could interrupt and say that. No one? Everyone?
Well, you know where I am, and so I don't know that I need to
Yeah, we know that your situation is moving from old BDS to Visual Studio, and I haven't had time to answer on everything this week, but we will get there. And I know that there's a sort of transformation that looks like it should be able to do mechanically, but as always with these things, it probably isn't 100%. Probably isn't easy.
Right. I think that understanding the pros and cons of various architecture might be worthwhile. That's sometimes a little overwhelming. We're running on it's small business, and so we have a small business server in-house that does everything for us.
Yeah.
Works well, but I don't know that that's necessarily the right architecture, and it happens to work well with WinForms, of course.
Yeah, so you have a SQL server on that.
Yeah, we have a box dedicated to it hosts SQL Server and our Eco solution, and we use Windows Remote Desktop, and each user gets their own desktop and creates an instance of the executable. Works great, not particularly scalable, I don't think. It is powerful in that it's a rich interface being WinForms. But as we look at view models, which I don't know this yet, but I think I'm about 80% that we're going to have to convert fully to view models as we move into MDriven. The concept of staying with the old data binding controls and staying with WinForms seems like it's not worthwhile. If it was a quick conversion, then it would make a good intermediate step.
Yeah.
My instinct is pulling me away from that, although we're still in research phases. But then the question then becomes, okay, so if we go to view models, which I understand the concept and agree with the value, what doors does that open? Do we look at, in my world, most products that run these kinds of small businesses today are cloud-based. Because the typical small business owner has no business maintaining an on-site server.
No.
And that's the
so that's always the issue with the small businesses. You don't really want a CPU in a cupboard somewhere collecting dust.
Yes and no. Agreed. And most small business owners just don't have the IT capacity to manage it and become very reliant on it. That being said, I think a lot of the solutions for this industry are cloud-based because it opens up more market space. I don't think it's necessarily better. It's just more expedient for those that are selling software. It's not bad per se, but it's not all win.
Yeah, so what we have said and stick to is that we are agnostic, really. Our stack can run on anything. Having an ISS and SQL Server, that's enough, or MySQL for that matter. And now also with the .NET Core, you don't need the ISS. Now, is it Internet Information Server? Is IIS. So then you can run on Linux, and that's sort of maybe it's complicating the discussion on where to run, but it's really a no-brainer. You can put it anywhere there's CPU. You can run it on AWS or Azure. And Azure is really easy because then you just click up a web app, and that really is a small web server, and then you can host it there. And that's what we sort of offer out of the box. But it's really easy to install on premises, and many of our corporate customers wouldn't be interested in having it in an open cloud. They might be in the cloud, but that's behind their own firewalls, etc. So it's not really private that we host it for them. We just deliver the software.
And I think that one of the paradigms or carpets that got pulled out from underneath us, we go back to Bold and to Delphi and to Visual Basic, is the need for distributed web-based systems that, that, I don't know, 15 years ago was an emerging thing and today is the thing. Yeah. And, for an old guy like me, that's still tricky because I, still remember programming before we had graphical user interface. And so just stretching my poor little brain with,
yeah.
What are we doing now?
There.
Yeah, but it seems like the view model is a big component of that in what we're doing, and that allows for more distributed, more disconnected, more cloud-based kind of crap. It's really not of high interest in terms of, and I've said this before, what we do is great, and what we have works very well. Our problem is almost exclusively modernity.
Yeah.
Our JIT is great. It's, Delphi Delphi Development Studio 06 running on this box, which is a Windows 10 box. My model will crash within 20 minutes of development now. It's becoming more and more unsustainable. And so that's the pure motivation, which I don't like to dominate these kinds of conversations with, because probably not everybody's problem.
Yeah, but the view models is a great vehicle for separating lots and lots and lots of coding from into the gist, to sort of make it documentation rather than code. So if you have it as documentation and a vehicle that easily can read the documentation mechanically and just do things, then we are in a much better space. And when .NET 6 is released and the thing they call the platform independent UI strategy in .NET 6, it's postponed to the spring, I think. But when that comes, it's possible for us to transform the documentation of view models into that paradigm as well. And let's see what happens then. But sort of it promises to deliver rich client experience anyway with the same bits. Let's see.
Are you talking about this to run a client basically within the browser?
Yes, but what Microsoft is doing with this technology is to compile native apps from the same source. So iOS native apps and Android native apps, and also WebAssembly apps. So it's the same source for all three of these, and also then Win 10, of course.
There's got to be a limitation to that, surely. I mean, insofar as, one screen's this big and one screen's this big.
Yeah. So and then of course it's the form factors that we need to think out of. Maybe we should do multiple view models, or maybe we should do some logic that transforms view models, but that's always picky to choose, or hard to choose to do mechanically. It's like when you do web responsive pages now, is all the information really shown on the phone as it is shown when you're on a large screen? And it depends. You can hide stuff. You can argue that no one with a phone will want to press this button, so we hide it. But then again, it's not a one thing.
Well, the danger is its use case, right?
Yeah.
It really, the software company should be looking at, if this component is being used on a phone, then it needs to be boiled down to the essentials in terms of, well, what's this user doing? Is it service person in the field getting a signature from a client. You know, that's quite a bit different than an administrator in an office building, you know, billing something or whatever. And so I don't know that trying to make the view model pliable enough to change really makes sense. Like, you should make a new view model for that new use case.
Yeah, so I think so as well. And maybe then it's more in sort of the navigation. When you click this action, we need to know what's your target environment, where are you, and if you want to look at this under these circumstances, we will serve you this view model.
Right. But then you also might want, you know, at least make the platform do as good as it can on the wrong device. So we have tried, you know, many strategies for this, and the view model quite successfully also allows you to make what's visible data driven, or, you know, you turn it on and off and things like that. So some things you can compact and some things you can hide, and some things you don't show until it's necessary because of the malleable structure of that. You can just subscribe to the data and then hide and show things.
Yeah,
but I will try to do another thing if I can. You know, you had Damien's use case and Bengt, and you seem both to like, because I don't know your use case, Damien. You have local installations today with a local thing or a terminal server, and Bengt, you seem to say that it's too heavy to run for your customers. And then if you need like 2 CPU cores to run one customer, I kind of wonder what they're doing.
Me too.
so then there might be other reasons for the performance. Just to take an example, I made a little app for time reporting for my daughter's circus club. They you know, jump on things and throw balls and stuff. Anyway, so they need a time reporting tool with export and integration to the salary payment. And I did that like 3 years ago, and I actually haven't upgraded it because I don't have any time for it, but it's like been there in a web app that is very low cost, and it's just been running there for 3 years, and it's at least 2 years since I heard anything.
So are they storing data to the compact database or on the
side? Yes.
Yeah.
They are. So it's not a lot of data. But what I wanted to like point out that, and I asked, you know, Damien and Bengt in this case, how much is needed in the UI for them to do? Because you can see, I mean, I see in that case, there are like 20 people logging in a week maybe and reporting their times. And that takes almost nothing. It's like, you know, it's nothing at all. But then let's say another project, we don't have that much data, but they upload documents and PDFs and Word documents and things like that. And then we store that in a Azure SQL, and it's horrendously slow on insert performance, the Azure DB, SQL DB. It's like ridiculous. It's like storing data through a thin straw down to the database. So I was thinking, Damien, I mean, in your case, can you deliver to your customers by installing 100 turnkey servers? You know, that's one use case. Or so don't be afraid, I would say sometimes, to, if they want separate installations, you can just install 100 servers. Because if you run them on one CPU, they don't take much each.
Yeah. We don't have a bottleneck problem. We have if we have any resource problem, it's limitations of WinForms 32. And as horrible as this sounds, the best solution was to put in an auto log off feature that a stale client that sits for too long just gets kicked out. And then because, I'm sorry, .NET 1.1 has memory leaks and so does WinForms, and I can't do anything about them.
No.
But if I don't let their executable just get fatter and fatter and fatter, everything works. It's once they get over about a gig in memory, things go bad. But that's totally modernity, right? It's all about the platform I'm sitting on. It's nothing to do with, it's nothing I have control over directly.
No.
You know, I do. There was a time when I didn't know the difference between a query and a PS query, and that was a good day when I figured that one out.
I was just coming to that, because that's one of the points that you can make. If you make a multi-tenant, I think they call it in the web world, I mean that you have many users sharing one database. You have to be really careful if you have like gigabytes of data. Do not use, all instances in the wrong way, because then you're screwed. And
especially if you use all instances, and then you pull up text strings that are 2,000 characters. Like now you got a fat, big, ugly problem. But what I do, and it's what you do, is I use my transient classes. And so if I need to get a bunch of big data pieces like that, they get pumped into a transient class, and you work with that. And then when you're done, I put your updates back. And now you're not stepping on each other's toes, and I don't have this thrashing of the database that becomes, just a big headache. So it works. And that's what I'm saying. What we're doing isn't bad. It generally works with the caveat of we're in older technology. But if there was a magic wand to just go, okay, bloop, it's now a 64-bit WinForms app in Visual Studio, there'd be little left to want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In my case, I store not lots of documents, but some documents, and I think some issues, performance issues, is if you still have a blob column in one table, it will not cache. Sorry?
I can't hear you.
Bad microphone.
Performance problem. No?
No. Check your microphone maybe.
Sorry.
Is it that one you're using? I don't think it is. I think it's down on the computer.
Okay. Wait.
Sorry, it wasn't me. I thought it was a quick fix.
But then you, Lars, you have your own server in a co-location.
But that's I use for remote desktops and not that much for running these things. But if you look at a standard machine 5 years old running a normal SQL database, it will run, crazy fast insert performance and stuff compared to actually a database you pay at least $150 euros a month for. So as you can see there, that Azure is, some things are really good actually, but some things are really poor when you just buy it like this tap based. Then it's probably better to buy a CPU and an SSD. So you'll get much better performance. So that's one thing to really consider. And as usual, when you're looking for problems, don't assume a lot of things. Well, we all assume, but it can be really something very different from what you expected.
So Azure is really, really good for the availability and the flexibility, and that you can go from one setup to another in minutes, and that's really good, but they will get paid.
Yeah. And in some instances, for like this time reporting, they have at least, it's not nothing, and it works really well, but they don't upload anything really, and the number of records are easily kept in memory. But if you let the users in another scenario like search for things, and you have, let's say, 100,000 users that they can search through, and don't let them return too much, because and of course every blob you have in your database should be lazy fetched. You can turn that on so that we don't fetch that right away. And so in these cases, when you feel it, you need to trim how you're loading stuff so you don't get too much into memory.
So one thing that we have had in the back burner to sort of think about if it's worth doing is now that the MDriven server knows, and it has this stats function that you can see how many objects and how what of the associations that you have on classes are actually used and how much they are used in numbers of objects, average and max and min. If we were to extract that as meta information and read it back into the model, then we would know on each association and on each class the volume. So it's sort of a statistics on how much of everything there is. And having that in the perspective of a view model, you could sort of make a calculation. Is this a heavy view model? What will happen when this runs? And then you could get sort of designer feedback that, well, you might have an issue here because you're doing all instances of customers, and customers are like 15,000. So this will take a hit. Maybe you should redesign that. Or you follow this link in the wrong direction. You're following it from a value store, sort of, what's the name of the type, and then you go from the type to customer. Okay, and there's lots of customers that has that value, so you will have penalty there. But you don't always think about this when you model. You rumble around the model and everything goes, and that's good, but there might be a cost, and the cost is not seen until you have a lot of data in your production system. So that might be a good thing to look at, to implement, to put back into the model, and also the view model editor to sort of explain what will happen when this runs typically. And fun fact, we also have this history server that sort of feeds back everything to a different MDriven server running in a different mode. And what it does is it grabs the same model. It before it starts, it looks through all the classes in the model and puts them into version, and then it sort of evolves the database, a separate database on that. So everything that's goes through the main master MDriven server is slowly fed back to the history server, and that makes it really good to find out what has happened. But I did that for quite a while ago, and then I always knew that we need to sort of truncate it some way, but I hadn't come around to it. And then at the client that Emily and I are working at, I did a check of the history server because it has been running since 2016, and the number of rows was 700 million. So when it slowly goes to 1 billion, I think it's time to start the trunking. So we did a thing that will truncate the history server to 3 years, and that's more reasonable amount. It got into 70 million rows, I think. But that's a really cool feature, and we're going to use that somehow. That if you have a history server set up, it's going to be possible sometime in the future to bring that up from a view model in a turnkey application, so that you could offer the client that looks at it, do you want to see history of this page? And then, because what we have found is that it really builds trust to a system, because every user thinks that, well, I don't agree with this data, it's bogus. Someone has changed it, or the system doesn't work because this wasn't the way that I saw it last time I checked. And that's just humanity. That's how we react to everything. And it really helps to be able to pinpoint and see, well, it seems like yesterday around noon you sort of deleted these things. Yeah, but I didn't mean to say that. Well, you did. Well, I shouldn't. So then it's much more, okay, then it's not a problem with the system. And then they are much more confident that the system actually knows what it's doing. It will always track everything and nothing will be sort of chance.
Can I bring up a different idea also for you to chew on? And it's like a little bit would be like a super feature for turnkey in the long run. And you might think about it. But if you look at the classic application, I'm using you, Damien, again as an example here. Your application, each session has all the objects it loads, right, in one memory space. So it's a copy in all the memory locations that run your application. But I mean, we really have very good checks on what's happening. So we could, I argue, basically have one copy, even if we have 100 users of the object that haven't been changed. So you would have one copy of all objects that is loaded from the backend, from the database. And then you have, like you read from one place, but you write changes to a separate memory location for each user. And then you show them what's there for them. And then when we save it to the database, or basically we save it through the MDriven server. And then we can throw away these exceptions to the read-only. And that would lower the cost of running each session to a very, very tiny amount of data. That would basically mean that you could have, on a 64-bit system, let's say you have one turnkey serving taking 10 gigabytes. And those 10 gigabytes will be able to handle a massive amount of users, because most of them are just looking at the same data. I mean, all the big registers will be just one copy in memory.
Yeah, and it's definitely doable, but the complicating factors are, of course, transient things. We need to keep those away, and because we quite often use transients as temporary user variables. That, okay, you're logged in, so current user, the transient link on current user is set to you. But since we know all this and we have it stored in a really orderly fashion, it's absolutely doable to separate those things out and only have the persistent things in the global cache. And the global cache will be like a sort of a object-oriented database that every transaction will go through. So if we need to fetch a single object, it might already be there, so the fetch operation can be skipped. And this will help if we have 1,000 users. Only the first one need to fetch. The first one looking at an object actually needs to fetch it. After that, we will keep track on it and see if it changes from another turnkey server. Then we need to refresh it from the database. But then we can offload the database quite a lot and only use the database for the searches, the PS searches that uses SQL to find relational things.
It sounds like just another formal layer in a tiered environment.
Yeah.
That's actually a pet peeve of mine, is that I've never found a good academic description of n-tiered, well, the paradigm I have, but it seems to me like we should have a definition of the 10 or the 7 or the 3 tiers that all software should have. And that's an irritation of mine that we don't have that we should have. I mean, obviously we've got, persistence. We've got whatever's interacting with persistence to make sure your database rules are followed. Then you've got what's being served up to a user. Then you've got your UI, but your UI has its rules. And it seems to me we should have 7 to 10 formal definitions of tiers, and that should be just part of our world of software development. And I have not found that, and it bugs me. But I think that's what you're talking about. It's just another tier, right?
Mm. Yeah, kind of. And you could argue that we already have it, but we're actually not using it when we're using MDriven and Turnkey and a lot of applications. I mean, this is actually what's going on in a SQL Server. But the SQL Server is not used like that, right? That's basically what the SQL Server does, and the optimizer and the memory loading, and that is like a pooling of in-memory stuff. And we are not, but no one is really using it in a good way. It could be used in a good way, but it's not usually, because you don't use it as the object store for dirty stuff before you save it. So the SQL Server has some of these features inbuilt, like memory sharing basically between the object. But then you rip it all apart when you send it back, or you rip it together and send it as a rectangular block of data to the client, that the client messes around with it completely, and you break it down. But let's say we had this glorious object server, then we wouldn't actually have to have a SQL Server. But we live in the technology stack that we do, and we think, we've been thinking about at least that the next possible step to make this more efficient is moving basically this feature into the MDriven server, because it can't be done by a SQL Server, because a SQL Server lacks all the metadata to really understand the data. And that's an argument that I sometimes get into with SQL, kings. It's like, but guys, why haven't you improved the metadata situation since 1978 or whatever year you take? Because it's basically, the SQL Server could do so much more for us. But it doesn't, because no one has asked it to do it.
Yeah, and we have the same issue on the front end or the back end coding. The languages hasn't really introduced any concept of association or persistent object either. So that leaves a lot of degrees of freedom for the developers or the coders to do a lot of crazy things that doesn't necessarily lead forward.
I mean, this thing that you can join whatever you want in a SQL Server.
Yeah, you can join the shoe
99.9%
size
of the cases. So basically, that's what we're saying, right? That we should, if we could move maybe the MDriven server or the Turnkey server, a combination of those together in a different, more optimized memory space, that would also lower the memory load and massively increase the performance. And the reason we can do that is all the metadata, I mean all the model stuff, because we know how things are connected, and it can only be connected that way. There's no way you can take just two different things and join them together in a rectangular shape and get it back from the server, which doesn't make any sense, and it's not optimizable at all. So, yes, think about how you, Damien, you seem to have been thinking about the tiering part of an application, and this would be maybe a new way to reap benefits of how we tier an application and where we have the data. We have also done, you have done, Hans, trials on basically fat thin clients. And that is a fat client that has a local memory space with objects, but it streams its data like a web client. So you have a central basically object space, and you bring parts of it to a fat client, but not by using SQL. So you use view model classes instead of model classes. So you only have the facade objects of your application, and not the business logic part of the application, which is another way of tiering things. You know, if I use a tier term here, a way of saying it's like, but let's make basically a Windows application or an application outside a web browser, but it takes some of the ideas from thinness from the browser. Another way of doing and using view models, because we call them view model classes in the view model designer, or at least in the back end, because they can actually be instantiated as classes. That is, so basically the view model definition is a definition of a transformation from business object to view objects. And then they can be in turn treated as something to be stored and worked on in a UI, not a web browser.
Yeah, and the main gain, or one of the gains, is from the security perspective, because if you have a client that almost all clients implement the security system that filters out data, and it's if you have a fat client, if you hack it, you can probably see more data than it was intended to show you. And that's sort of the decline of the fat client that comes from that there is no way to actually protect the fat client. And the web systems only display the actual things that are shown on screen, and there's nothing more to gain by looking inside the web client. That used to be true, but as more and more web clients are getting more and more sophisticated to resemble fat clients, it's easy to see that there's a danger that you put more and more data out in the client and filter in the client, because that's where you know the last few meters to the client, and then you're back in the security issue that someone will open the browser and hack the browser and see what's in there.
So this would open a different way of slicing a native client also. How about that you had an iPhone application that had this like API? I mean, that's a classic way of doing it, right? You make an iPhone or an Android app and you have an API. But let's say that API was just the view model definition. Well, you wouldn't get all the benefits of a separate API and a local data store, but you could actually do some of it, because you can cache the view model things, and we have all the web client already does that. It caches some of the view models for someone. That's why it's quick to go back and forth. But you could do that on a more extensive level, and you could even do speculative loading of the views around the view you are in, which I have been thinking about for quite some time in the web client. Why don't we fetch the pages you could navigate to if you wanted to navigate, and we load them in the background? So if the user decides to click on that thing, we have already gotten that data because we speculated that they would navigate. And then we would reap another benefit of the view model and the declarative approach, because we can actually pre-calculate the different outcomes from where they are. And the cool thing with the view models and the streaming thing is that if you cache something, what happens even today when you use a stream interface for the UI is that when you go back and pick up a cached version, you show that first, but you also right away ask, is there any updates to this view? And then you only get the changes. So you can go back to a view and get 2 attributes and put them on screen. So it's a really powerful way. You could, in this way, have a list of view models around the user, always updating in the background. And that way you could get a native application that could even include some of the view model mechanisms and get the good part of, for example, very fast access to native features like camera, scanners, other things, fast graphics, and still retain the power of having a view model as defining features, and also the view models for security that you can define with access groups and things what should be available in the clients. And you get that filtering done on the server side. So there's so many ways to use a fully defined application.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a long talk, but I kind of find this exciting if we can find new ways to use it.
I think if you're going to do a speculative type load like that, which is great, your model is going to need to define what is sensitive data and probably never load that without an explicit request for it. Because you're going to be looking around what someone's doing right now, and if they're the administrator, they may well be able to see certain sensitive data, and if they're not, they're not. But it's kind of like you got a flashlight shining on this stuff here, and the stuff right around it is what you're going to load speculatively. Well, you better be careful.
The view model will filter that on access groups anyway, so that's not a problem. I'm sorry.
So we need to round things up, and I want to thank everyone for showing up tonight. Really good to see so many faces, and hope that we can meet again in 2 weeks.
Yeah, Brian, you haven't been here in a while, I feel. So yeah, it would be nice to know if there's something specific that will bring you back more.
Did you say Brian?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been very busy lately, so that's been some of it on why. And you weren't for the summer.
Yeah, we were
I
off.
missed last. Yeah.
We were off
But if you
summer.
have something that you want us, that interests you, please get in touch and tell us.
Yes.
Yeah.
You talk a lot about your view models, and I'm not using them, so that part is. I did try to use them, but I guess from my standpoint, they're too stateful for me. My server is completely stateless, and I don't want to get involved with something that needs to be stateful. I do kind of like the idea you're talking about, maybe caching objects, because I create a new eco space which with each request that comes in for a web request. And if I had a cache sitting there, I wouldn't have to be going to the database to fetch all these commonly used objects all the time. So that would certainly be of interest, but obviously that's a big undertaking that you may never even attempt. I try to do it.
We already do that.
You do that?
Well, kind of, because
We will postpone this discussion to another session, so we respect people's time. So thank you very much for showing up tonight, and see you in 2 weeks.
We can look at EcoSpace pooling some other time.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, bye.
Thanks.
Thanks.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.